I still remember the first time I walked up to the old mine. The sun had already dipped behind hills, and a cold, thin fog crept over the ground, swallowing the trail I had followed so carefully. The mine's entrance yawned like a dark mouth, its timbers rotting, groaning faintly as the wind whispered through them. I paused at the threshold, feeling a silence so deep it pressed against my ears, broken only by the distant drip of water echoing from somewhere deep below. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and rust, and for a moment I thought I saw a movement inside, subtle, almost teasing, like shadows dancing just beyond the light of my lantern. Every instinct told me to leave, but curiosity was heavier than fear. As I stepped closer, the fog seemed to thicken, curling around my legs, and I heard it, a faint, hollow voice calling my name. That's when I saw it, just beyond the lantern's glow. Peering out from the darkness, the trail was quiet. Fog curled around my ankles, soft and damp, smelling faintly of wet earth and decay. Twilight hung low, painting everything in pale gray. The mine appeared before me, half swallowed by shadow. The timbers at the entrance groaned under their own weight. A faint wind whispered through the hollow, carrying a rustling, hollow sigh. I paused. The air felt heavier here, like it was waiting for something. My fingers brushed against the cold with a rail, rough and splintered. A shadow shifted inside the tunnel. I blinked. It could have been the fog, but my chest tightened anyway. The smell of damp stone seeped into my nose, mineral and sharp. Soft footsteps, or maybe echoes of them, tapped somewhere deep within. I wanted to turn back, but the path drew me in, like a quiet insistence I couldn't name. The darkness wasn't complete. A pale, uneven light spilled from somewhere further in, flickering against the walls. It painted shapes that weren't really there. I took another step. The floor beneath my boots crunched with loose gravel, sending tiny sprays of dust into the cold air. It smelled faintly of rust and old iron. There was a hush, almost like the mine was breathing. A shiver ran down my spine. I could hear my own pulse, steady and small. A sound came then, not loud, just a soft scraping, low and deliberate. It made me stop. My breath caught. I leaned closer to the timbers, feeling the rough wood against my fingertips. The shadows inside seemed to stretch, twitching along the walls. Something moved, just beyond the flickering light. I shouldn't have looked, but my eyes drifted toward it. A dark shape lingered at the tunnel's edge, vanishing when I blinked. The fog pressed closer, curling around my legs, whispering against my skin. The air was thick now, wet with the smell of stone and rot. I could hear faint scratching, like claws against wood, faint and soft. I stepped forward, slow. The light wavered. A cold breeze drifted from the tunnel's mouth, carrying whispers I couldn't understand. I thought about turning back, but something held me. Not curiosity exactly, more like a quiet insistence. A presence, almost gentle, urging me deeper. The shadows moved again. They weren't quite shadows, more like shapes pressed against the walls, restless and patient. They flickered with the pale light, vanishing when I looked too closely. A sudden clatter echoed somewhere far in the mine. I flinched. The sound rolled along the walls and sank into the ground, leaving only silence behind. I could feel the cool dampness seeping through my shoes. Every step left a tiny imprint in the dust. The air smelled of wet stone and something older. The tunnel seemed longer than it should have been. Every echo of my movement felt exaggerated, stretched. The pale light ahead seemed thinner, more fragile, almost as if it could disappear entirely. I leaned against a timber to steady myself. It trembled under my hand, not from wind, but from something else, something alive. The fog inside the mine swirled, wrapping around me, curling into the corners of my vision. And then there was nothing. The light dimmed. The shadows stretched. I stood very still. The only thing I could hear was my own breath, and, just barely, a soft, deliberate shuffle behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. The lantern trembled in my hand. Its light was weak, pale, spilling in uneven patches across the walls. The air smelled damp, earthy, tinged with something faintly metallic. I stepped inside. The ground was rough underfoot, scattered with small stones and dust. Each step kicked up a faint rustling, soft enough to almost disappear. Shadows lingered in the corners. They shifted when I wasn't looking, curling along the walls, hesitant. I thought I saw shapes press against a stone, pale and still. The lantern flickered again. The light danced across the cavern ceiling, catching glints of moisture, glittering faintly. I could feel the cold seep through my jacket, prickling my skin. I paused, listening. A hum hovered in the distance, low and constant, like the mine itself was breathing. The smell of wet stone deepened, mixed with a faint, sour tang I couldn't place. Soft steps echoed somewhere far ahead. Or maybe it was a lantern's own trembling against the cold air. I held it tighter, feeling the warmth of flame through my fingers. Shapes moved again. Not solid, more like shadows with intention, brushing the edges of my vision. I blinked and they were gone. A cool breeze brushed against my neck, carrying whispers I couldn't understand. It made the lantern waver, casting light that twisted across the walls. I could feel the stone under my palm, rough and damp, vibrating faintly. The cavern opened wider. Stalactites hung overhead, dripping water that smelled faintly of iron. Each droplet hit the ground with a soft tap, rhythmical and slow. I took another step. The lantern's light caught something on the floor. Tiny scratches, etched deep into the stone. I crouched, brushing my fingers over them. They were fresh. The shadows shifted again. This time they seemed almost aware, lingering longer in the corners, waiting. I could hear a faint rustling, like dry leaves moving in the dark. I moved forward, careful. The flame flickered, revealing shapes that weren't there before. They lingered just long enough for me to question what I saw. A hollow hum filled the air, rising and falling like a breath. It wrapped around me, slow and patient. I pressed the lantern closer, feeling its warmth through my chest. A faint smell of smoke drifted in, sweet and sharp, though there was no fire. It mingled with the wet stone, creating a strange, heavy aroma. The flickering light made the shadows twist in ways that didn't feel natural. I stopped again. The cavern seemed to stretch farther than it should, endless in the dim glow. Shapes lingered at the edges, just beyond reach, always just out of focus. The lantern flickered violently. For a moment, the cavern was swallowed in darkness. My breath caught. When the light returned, the shapes were closer. They weren't solid, but they pressed against the walls, moving in deliberate patterns. I could feel the hum vibrating in the stone beneath my feet. I stepped forward. The shadows receded slightly, as if acknowledging me, as if waiting for something I couldn't name. The lantern's flame shivered in my hand, soft and fragile. A soft scrape echoed from the far side of the cavern. I froze, my ears strained. The scrape repeated once, then faded. The air was still again, heavy with silence. I whispered my own breath back to myself, steadying the lantern. The shapes lingered, distant, watching. I could feel them, patient and quiet, as if the cavern itself was alive. The lantern flickered one last time. Its light danced softly across the walls, highlighting the textures of stone and shadow. And then stillness. I stood alone, the hum fading into silence. The shadows waited, patient and patient. And the lantern burned, small and fragile, in the endless dark. The cavern seemed to stretch forever. Every step I took bounced back at me, longer and slower than it should. The echoes were too precise, too deliberate, as if something else was matching them. The air was cold, heavy with wet stone and a faint metallic tang. My boots crunched against gravel, yet the echo came from all directions. I stopped. The repetition lingered, but my footsteps had ceased. A soft rustling brushed the edges of my hearing. I turned, slowly. Nothing moved, just shadows twisting along the walls, pale and restless. I took another step. The echo came again, just after mine, delayed but somehow too close. It wasn't me. The lantern flickered, spilling patches of light that barely reached the ceiling. Shapes appeared in the corners, shifting, patient. I could smell dampness in the air, mingle with the faint sweetness of decay. The echoes followed each movement. Sometimes they arrived before I even stepped, mocking, echoing a presence I could not see. My chest tightened, heartbeat matching the rhythm of something unseen. I brushed my fingers along the rough stone wall. It was cold and slightly wet, slippery in places. A shiver traveled up my spine, carried by the damp air. The shadows grew longer as I moved deeper. They twisted in ways that felt intentional, aware. Sometimes they merged into shapes that nearly looked human. A distant tap echoed. Then another, slower. The rhythm didn't match any part of my movement. I paused, holding the lantern close. The light trembled in my hand, and the cavern seemed to lean in toward me. The hum in the distance rose and fell, like breathing, slow and deliberate. Every echo now seemed to have its own weight, pressing against the walls. Soft footsteps brushed along the ceiling above, or perhaps beside me. I couldn't tell if it was real or imagined. I tried to move quietly. Even then, the echoes followed, whispering my path back at me. The air smelled colder here, like frost settling on damp stone. The cavern narrowed. The lantern revealed scratches on the walls, deep and erratic, clawed into the stone. They were fresh, sharp with the smell of raw stone, and something older. The echoes grew louder, sharper, closer. I could feel them vibrating through the floor, beneath my boots. A shiver of awareness passed through me. Something else was moving, just out of view. The shadows pulled at the edges of the lantern light. They didn't flicker or sway. They waited. I could feel them, patient, silent, breathing along with me. I stepped forward, slow. Each echo came slightly ahead of my footfall, anticipating me. The hum rose higher, then fell, stretching the silence in between. A soft scrape drifted from somewhere deep within the dark. It moved along the walls, brushing past stones, deliberate and quiet. I froze. My own breath echoed in the cavern, uneven and ragged. The lantern flickered violently, then steadied. The shadows appeared closer now, just beyond reach. I could feel their presence, pressing gently against the edges of the air. I wanted to run, but my feet felt heavy, tethered to the ground. The echoes continued, patient, relentless, matching me step for step. The cavern seemed alive, waiting for me to falter. I took one last careful step. The echoes lingered a fraction too long, then receded, leaving only the hum and my own breath. The shadows shifted back into the corners, distant but attentive. The lantern burned steadily, small and fragile in my hand. The air was still now, thick with the scent of damp stone and something watching. I stood alone, surrounded by echoes, and listened. The cavern narrowed again. Water dripped from the ceiling, cold and slow, into small puddles that smelled faintly of iron. Each droplet made a tiny splash, echoing far longer than it should. I stopped. The lantern trembled in my hand, casting flickering light across rough walls. Shadows seemed to gather in corners, patient, shifting, waiting. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft, almost lost beneath the dripping water. A name. I froze, listening. Another followed, slow and deliberate, curling through the damp air like smoke. It was barely audible, yet unmistakable. Human, faint yearning. The whispers repeated, layering over one another. Some names I recognized from old stories, miners lost long ago. Others, I didn't know, but the tone was the same. Soft, empty, searching. The air pressed against my skin. It smelled of wet stone, iron, and something older, more bitter, like old smoke. My fingers brushed the lantern, feeling the warmth fail to reassure me. I stepped forward. The echoes of my boots bounced back, yet behind them, the whispers followed, careful, intentional. I could feel the cavern leaning closer, as if listening too. The lantern flickered. Shadows lengthened along the walls, pressing against the stone in strange, unnatural ways. I thought I saw shapes leaning from the darkness, dissolving when I blinked. A soft rustling drifted through the air. The whispers continued, curling around me, calling names that didn't belong to anyone living. Each syllable was wet with sadness, heavy with something I couldn't name. I held the lantern higher. The pale light revealed scratches along the walls, deep, jagged, like someone had clawed their way through the stone. The echoes of names seemed to linger near them, pressing into the air. The cavern grew colder. My breath hung thick and visible, mist curling into the lantern's light. The whispers grew more insistent, curling around the dripping water, layering over the echoes of my movement. I tried to ignore them. The lantern swung slightly, revealing hollow pits and shadows where the earth had fallen away. The names persisted, soft, mournful, impossible to place or answer. The ground under my boots shifted slightly. Dust and small stones crunched as if someone, or something, was moving with me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. The whispers moved closer, brushing my ears, teasing the edges of my mind. I could feel the weight of them, patient and cold. Some names repeated, calling out like a memory that refused to fade. I stopped again. The water dripped steadily, filling the silence between the whispers. I could feel dampness creeping through my shoes, chilling me to the bone. The lantern flickered one last time. Shadows pooled and merged into the corners, nearly solid now. I could sense them watching, patient and still. The names faded, leaving only the drip of water and the hum of the cavern itself. I pressed the lantern closer, feeling its fragile warmth against my chest. And then I moved forward, alone, the soft voices lingering just behind me, patient, waiting. The tunnel narrowed again, walls slick with damp. The air smelled sharp, iron and dust, like old metal left to rot. I could feel the chill creeping through my sleeves, brushing against my arms. Ahead, the tools lay scattered. Pickaxes, shovels, hammers, rusted and worn, resting as if abandoned long ago. The lantern's flicker caught glints of metal, uneven and alive. I stepped closer. The handles were rough under my fingers, splintered with age. I brushed the dust from a blade. The rust crumbled softly, falling like dry leaves. Something shifted. A hammer rolled slightly to the side, though I hadn't touched it. I froze. My chest tightened. The air tasted colder, sharper. The shadows leaned closer. They twisted around the tools, twitching when I looked directly, folding back into the corners when I blinked. The lantern's pale light trembled in my hand, casting shapes that seemed almost deliberate. I knelt beside a pickaxe. Its edge was jagged, flaking. I could feel the roughness against my palm, gritty and cold. A faint hum seemed to pulse beneath the floorboards, low and patient. The tools shifted again. A shovel slid forward a few inches. Soft, dry scraping echoed along the walls, precise and intentional. The shadows pooled in the corners. They were thin, almost vaporous, curling around the tools as if waiting. The air smelled of damp iron and old leather, heavy in my nostrils. I tried to move my hand. The pickaxe rattled softly, then stilled. It felt like the room itself was aware of my attention, pressing lightly against my skin. A rustling came from the pile. The tools weren't heavy, yet they shifted as if stirred by invisible fingers. I could hear the scrape of metal against stone, soft and deliberate. The lantern flickered violently. Shadows danced across the walls, stretching, contracting. I blinked, and the edges seemed to curl away, watching, patient. The floor beneath my boots felt uneven, the gravel loose. Each step made a tiny spray of dust rise, mixing with the metallic tang of rust. The tools moved in response, minute, subtle, just enough to disturb the silence. I leaned closer to a hammer, lying on its side. The wood was brittle, rough against my palm, vibrating faintly under my touch. A chill slid down my spine, cold and patient. I held my breath. The shadows pulsed, twisting like smoke around the metal. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper drifted through the tunnel, curling along the walls. The lantern flickered again. For a moment, the tools appeared to lean toward me, stretching unnaturally. The shadows twitched at the edges, then folded back into darkness. I stepped back. The hum underfoot faded slightly, leaving only the soft drip of water far in the cavern. The tools rested again, silent and patient, but I could feel their weight in the still air. I straightened, brushing my palms on my knees. The lantern's glow caught the glint of rust once more, pale and fragile. I moved slowly past them, careful, carrying the quiet with me, leaving the twitching shadows behind. The tunnel sloped downward. A faint glow spilled from somewhere below, pale and uncertain, brushing the walls with soft light. It smelled faintly of damp stone and something sweet, almost burned, clinging to the cold air. I paused. The lantern trembled in my hand, barely cutting to the shadows around me. The glow seemed alive, pulsing faintly, inviting, patient. Each step toward it made the air heavier. Dust rose under my boots, mingling with the cold dampness. The faint hum beneath my feet seemed to echo upward, answering the glow. The walls narrowed, slick and cold against my palms. Shadows twisted along the rock, curling toward the light like fingers. I could hear soft scratching somewhere deep in the shaft, deliberate and patient. The glow grew warmer, soft orange against the gray stone. It revealed shapes etched into walls, faint scratches, deep lines, old and trembling. I traced one with my fingertips. The stone was cold, rough, almost wet. A soft breeze rose from below. It carried whispers, faint and indecipherable, brushing against my ears. I shivered, the chill crawling along my neck and arms. The light seemed to shift, beckoning me. It spilled across a stairwell carved into the stone, uneven and slick. Each step downward felt heavier, as if the air itself resisted my movement. The hum beneath my feet deepened. It was slow, rhythmic, patient, almost like breathing. The shadows along the walls stretched, twitching with intention, then withdrawing. I leaned closer to the railing. The wood was rough, damp, splintering under my fingers. The glow reflected faintly in the damp patches of my skin, pale and shifting. A soft scrape echoed from the lower shaft. Something moved down there, careful, deliberate, but unseen. The whispers swirled in the air, faint names curling around my thoughts. The lantern flickered. The glow below pulsed in rhythm with the soft hum, guiding me, patient. Shapes pressed to the edges of the light, twitching just beyond reach. I stepped down slow. The wood beneath my boots groaned lightly, dust rising in tiny clouds. The air smelled of wet stone and faint iron, mingled with that strange, sweet tang again. The glow grew brighter as I descended. It revealed piles of stone, jagged and sharp, curling into darkness around the edges. I could feel the shadows brushing against the walls, stretching toward me. A faint whisper drifted upward. It was soft, patient, almost inviting, curling around my chest like cold fingers. I pressed the lantern closer, feeling the fragile warmth against my palms. The shaft seemed endless. Every step brought me closer to the glow, but also deeper into a quiet unease. I could feel something watching, patient, waiting just beyond the fragile light. The air thickened, cold and heavy, carrying the hum and the faint, sweet tang of something burned. The glow pulsed again, soft and deliberate, beckoning. I moved downward, alone, carrying the small lantern, leaving the twisting shadows above behind. The shaft grew colder as I descended. The lantern's glow trembled, spilling thin light across slick, uneven stone. The air smelled sharp, iron and damp, heavy with the tang of something unseen. I paused. A chill brushed the back of my neck, sudden and deliberate. It wasn't the cold air from the shaft. It was closer, intimate, like a presence leaning near. I held the lantern tighter. Shadows twisted along the walls, curling and folding in on themselves. The floor beneath my boots was rough, uneven, vibrating faintly under each step. The chill returned, brushing across my shoulders, lingering just long enough to make me shiver. I could feel it moving along the edges of my skin, patient and deliberate. The air seemed thicker here, pressing against my chest and ears. Soft rustling came from the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but something moved just beyond the glow of the lantern. The scent of damp stone and faint smoke wrapped around me. I took a careful step forward. The cold pressed against my neck again, almost like breath, soft and chilling. Shadows leaned closer, twitching when I glanced at them, then retreating. The lantern flickered violently. For a moment, the shaft was swallowed in darkness. My heartbeat filled the silence, loud and uneven, echoing along the stone walls. When the light returned, the chill had shifted. It lingered along my arm, patient, deliberate, almost tactile. I could feel a presence nearby, moving with careful attention, unseen but aware. I tried to steady my breath. The air smelled of wet stone, faint iron, and something else old, bitter, almost metallic. Every sound, my boots, the dripping water, the faint hum beneath the stone, felt amplified. A soft scrape drifted across the walls, deliberate and slow. The chill pressed closer again, brushing my cheek this time. I could almost feel the shape of it, just beyond perception. The lantern trembled in my hand, flickering across jagged stones and puddles. Shadows twisted and stretched, coiling along the walls like smoke. The chill lingered, patient and waiting, brushing every exposed inch of skin. I took another step, slow, careful. The air seemed heavier with each movement, thick and cold, almost wet. The scrape repeated, low and deliberate, echoing against the walls. I pressed the lantern closer, its warmth fragile against the chill. The shadows pulled in corners, twitching at the edges, unseen but aware. I could feel them pressing toward me, patient, silent. A soft exhale brushed past my ear. Not wind, not mine. Something colder, deliberate, moving past, unnoticed. I froze, letting the moment stretch, listening to the drip of water and my own uneven breath. The chill finally faded slightly, leaving only the weight of the shadows. The hum under the stone receded into silence. I stood still, alone, feeling the lingering presence in the air, patient and watching. The lantern burned steadily now, fragile and small. The cold had passed, but the memory of it remained, pressed against my skin. I moved onward, careful, carrying its warmth with me, leaving the unseen just behind. The shaft grew narrower. Dust clung to the damp walls, heavy and silent, with the faint smell of wet stone and iron. My boots pressed against uneven gravel, crunching softly under each careful step. Then it began. A rock shifted, falling just a foot from my toes. It landed without sound, as if swallowed by the darkness itself. I froze. The lantern trembled in my hand, spilling pale light across jagged stone. Shadows stretched and flickered, curling around the edges of the falling debris. Another rock fell, again, silently, unhurried. The ground beneath me shivered, subtle, almost imperceptible. I held my breath. The cavern seemed alive, breathing, pressing in from all sides. A faint hum vibrated through the floor, resonating in my chest. The rocks continued to fall, small and deliberate, each landing somewhere unseen. Dust rose with each shift, mixing with the cool, damp air. It smelled of stone and old iron, heavy and bitter. I stepped forward slowly. The gravel gave slightly beneath my boots, trembling with each subtle tremor. Shadows twisted along the walls, bending toward the unseen source of the rocks. A larger stone dropped nearby, vibrating through the floor. The hum beneath my feet grew, low and patient. It pressed against my chest, filling the space with tension I could feel in my bones. The lantern flickered. Shapes emerged in the pale light, jagged stones leaning against walls like frozen hands. The air smelled faintly metallic, cold and sharp, carrying the taste of dust on my tongue. I moved carefully, each footstep echoing in the cavern. The rocks shifted again, tumbling silently, falling in places I could not see. I could feel the tremor beneath me, rhythmic and insistent, pressing against my balance. Shadows pulled in the corners. They twitched when I glanced toward them, receding when I looked directly. The ground shivered lightly, almost like heartbeat in the stone itself. A small stone brushed past my ankle. I flinched, though no one was above. The tremor beneath my feet persisted, subtle but constant. I pressed the lantern closer, its warmth fragile against the chill. Dust fell from the ceiling in tiny clouds, carried by the unseen movements. The hum beneath me rose slightly, then faded, patient, like something watching. Another rock tumbled past, heavier this time. It settled in the darkness, invisible, but I could feel its weight in the air. The shadows seemed to lean closer, patient, deliberate, coiling around the falling stones. I moved forward slowly, careful, boots sinking into the rough gravel. The tremors beneath my feet seemed to anticipate each step, rolling along the shaft like a pulse. The pale lantern light caught edges of stones, casting twisted shadows across the walls. The rocks finally stilled, leaving only dust and faint tremor in the floor. The air was heavy, still, smelling of iron, stone, and the faint tang of something older. I stood alone, the lantern fragile in my hands, and listened. The cavern seemed patient, silent, waiting. The tremor beneath me lingered faintly, a quiet reminder that the unseen was still near. I moved onward, careful, carrying the fragile glow, leaving the falling rocks behind in the shadows. The tunnel narrowed, slick with damp stone. My boots pressed into the uneven floor, crunching softly against gravel and dust. The air smelled of iron and wet stone, cold and heavy against my skin. A shadow stretched ahead. Tall, impossibly dark, it moved across the walls like smoke caught in the lantern's glow. It was there, then gone, flickering with a strange, unnatural patience. I stepped closer. The lantern trembled in my hands. Pale light spilling weakly over the jagged walls. The shadow shifted, curling along the stone like fingers reaching outward. It moved again, not randomly. Deliberate, fluid, stretching across the tunnel before fading into the darkness. I could feel it pressing along the edges of the air, patient, watching. The floor beneath me seemed colder, damp seeping through my boots. A faint hum vibrated under the stone, subtle but insistent, echoing through the walls. Every step made the shadow twitch, responding to me, anticipating. I paused. The air smelled metallic, tangy, carrying the faint sweetness of old dust and stone. The shadow lingered, bending and twisting where the lantern could barely reach. I leaned closer, careful. The stone under my fingertips was rough, wet, and cold. The shadow retracted slightly, then stretched again, deliberate, patient. A soft rustling drifted from further down the tunnel. The shadow flinched, or maybe it mirrored me, and vanished into the black. I could feel the air pressing against my chest, heavy and expectant. I moved forward slowly. The lantern flickered, revealing jagged rocks and puddles of cold water. The shadows pulled at the edges, twitching as if aware of my presence. Another step. The shadow returned, stretching across the walls ahead. I could sense it shifting just beyond the glow, patient, deliberate, untouchable. The hum underfoot deepened, vibrating through my boots and bones. Every rock, every crack in the wall seemed alive with anticipation. I could feel the air thicken, pressing against my neck and shoulders. The shadow moved again, faster this time, then vanished when I stepped closer. The lantern's glow trembled, weak and fragile, revealing only empty walls. The air smelled damp, metallic, and something older, bitter, patient, unseen. I froze, holding the lantern high. The tunnel seemed endless, twisting, swallowing light and sound. The shadow was gone, but its weight lingered, pressing against the edges of perception. The hum faded slowly, leaving only silence and the faint drip of water from the ceiling. I could feel the memory of the shadow pressing against me, patient, deliberate, unmoving. I moved forward, careful, carrying the fragile lantern, leaving the shifting darkness behind. The tunnel ended abruptly. A pile of rubble blocked the way forward, jagged stone stacked unevenly, cold and rough under my fingers. The air smelled of wet dust and iron, heavy and still. I crouched, brushing loose gravel aside. The lantern's glow flickered, spilling light over the rough wall. Something caught my eye, faint markings etched deep into the stone. They glowed softly, pale and unnatural, almost pulsing with the lantern's rhythm. The lines twisted and curled, sharp in some places, delicate in others. I traced one with a fingertip, cold stone scraping gently against my skin. A soft hum rose beneath my boots. It vibrated through the floor, steady, insistent, like the cavern itself was breathing. I could smell the damp stone, the faint tang of iron, and something else, bitter, unfamiliar. The rubble shifted slightly. Small stones tumbled down, echoing softly against the walls, but no one was above. Shadows flickered across the glowing markings, twitching when I looked directly at them. I leaned closer. The glow pulsed faintly, revealing strange symbols carved with precision. They were almost alive, curling and stretching in the corners of the light. A chill brushed my neck, soft and deliberate. I shivered, feeling the presence of the unseen pressing gently against the air. The hum beneath me grew, low and patient, vibrating into my chest. I stepped back, careful, boots crunching on loose stones. The markings seemed to respond, glowing brighter for a moment, then fading. The air smelled heavier now, damp and metallic, pressing against my skin. I pressed the lantern closer to the wall. The symbols twisted faintly in the pale light, delicate lines shifting just out of reach. I could feel the weight of the collapsed shaft behind me, pressing the air tight around my chest. A small stone rolled from the rubble. It landed with no sound, yet the vibration traveled through the floor to my boots. Shadows pulled at the edges, patient and still, twitching in response to the light. I crouched again, tracing another line. The stone felt cold, rough, almost alive under my fingertips. The glow pulsed faintly, rhythmic, like the symbols were breathing with the cavern. The hum beneath me lingered, steady and insistent. Dust rose with each shift of the rubble, mixing with the heavy, metallic air. I could hear the faint drip of water far in the shaft, echoing softly, almost like a heartbeat. The lantern flickered violently. The symbols glowed brighter for an instant, revealing the jagged edges of the collapsed stones. Then the light steadied, soft and fragile, leaving the markings faint but persistent. I stood slowly, careful not to disturb the stones further. The symbols remained, faintly glowing, patient and watching. The air smelled of stone, iron, and something older, bitter, almost alive. I moved forward, careful, carrying the fragile lantern. The collapsed shaft pressed behind me, silent, heavy, waiting. The glow of the strange markings lingered in my vision, and I felt their weight in the air as I left. The tunnel sloped gently downward. The air smelled of wet stone, iron, and something faintly bitter, almost metallic. My boots pressed into gravel, uneven, cold beneath my feet. A low hum began. It vibrated through the rock, steady, rhythmic, as if the cavern itself was breathing. I stopped, holding the lantern higher, its pale light trembling in my hands. The hum grew, patient and deliberate. It pressed against my chest, curling around my ribs like slow, invisible fingers. Shadows twisted along the walls, bending toward the sound, then receding when I glanced directly. The air thickened. Dust rose in tiny clouds on the floor, mixing with the scent of stone and iron. The hum seemed alive, pulsing beneath my boots, patient, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I stepped forward carefully. The lantern flickered, revealing jagged edges and wet patches along the tunnel walls. The vibration beneath me echoed up through my legs, insistent, rhythmic, almost intentional. The hum carried through the air. It filled the cavern, coiling around my ears, brushing my skin with pressure I could feel, but not see. Every rock, every crack seemed to resonate, amplifying the sound in uneven, deliberate pulses. I crouched slightly, tracing my fingers along a damp wall. The stone was cold and rough, wet beneath my fingertips. The hum seemed to pulse through it, vibrating faintly against my palm, alive in the rock itself. A faint rustling drifted through the tunnel. The hum responded, dipping and rising, curling around the movement. I held my breath, listening, feeling it echo through the floor beneath my boots. The shadows twisted again, stretching along the jagged stones. They seemed drawn to the vibration, patient, deliberate, waiting at the edges of the pale lantern glow. The hum pulsed faster, deliberate, like some rhythm I almost recognized, impossible to place. I moved forward slowly, careful, each step deliberate. The lantern trembled in my hand, catching the faint glint of wet patches along the walls. The air felt heavy now, pressing against my skin, cold and damp, scented faintly of iron and dust. The hum deepened, filling the tunnel entirely. It vibrated in my chest and my teeth, beneath my boots, patient and insistent. The shadows remained at the edges, twitching ever so slightly, observing unseen. I pressed the lantern closer to the wall. Faint streaks of mineral caught the light, glittering softly, moving subtly with each pulse. The hum seemed to follow, curling through every crack and crevice, deliberate, patient, alive. A small stone shifted beneath my foot. The hum responded, dropping briefly, then rising again, insistent. I could feel the vibration pressing up through the soles of my boots, into my legs, echoing in my chest. I stopped, holding the lantern high. The shadows pulled in the corners, patient, stretching, curling. The hum thrummed to the cavern, steady, deliberate, leaving a weight in the air I could not shake. I moved onward slowly, careful. The vibration lingered beneath me, the hum curling through the rock and air. I carried the fragile lantern forward, leaving the pressing, rhythmic sound behind, though its memory clung to my chest. The tunnel opened slightly, revealing a small, empty alcove, The air smelled of damp stone and rust, heavy and still against my skin. My boots crunched softly over loose gravel as I stepped forward. Something caught my eye. A helmet, old and dented, lay on the stone floor. Its surface was dull, pitted with rust, but something about it felt alive. I knelt, careful, brushing dust from its edges. The metal was cold, rough under my fingers, faintly damp. The air around it seemed heavier, pressing against my chest, patient, waiting. A soft draft whispered through the tunnel. It carried the scent of stone and iron, mingled with something older, bitter, almost metallic. I shivered, feeling the pressure of the air, like a presence leaning close. The lantern trembled in my hand. Shadows pulled along the walls, curling toward the alcove and retreating when I glanced directly. The helmet seemed to watch, patient, deliberate, though motionless. I leaned closer, touching its rim. The stone floor beneath me felt rough and cold, dampness creeping through my gloves. A faint hum rose from the walls, low and insistent, vibrating softly against my chest. I pulled back slightly. The helmet remained still, yet the air around it felt alive, almost breathing. I could feel it pressing gently against my shoulders, patient and deliberate. A soft rustle came from deeper in the tunnel. The shadows responded, twitching and stretching, curling closer to the alcove. I held my breath, listening to the faint drip of water far above and the hum beneath the stone. The lantern flickered. The helmet seemed darker for a moment, edges blending with the shadows. The air smelled colder now, metallic and bitter, carrying the weight of something unseen. I crouched again, careful, brushing the gravel near the helmet. Each touch made the shadows stretch, twitch, responding in quiet, deliberate ways. The hum beneath me pulsed faintly, rhythmic, like a heartbeat I could feel through my boots. The helmet stayed still, but the air pressed closer, patient, insistent, brushing against my neck and arms. I felt watched not by eyes, but by presence deliberate and silent. I stepped back slowly, careful not to disturb the alcove. The lantern's glow trembled over the rough walls, revealing wet patches and jagged stone. The helmet seemed to linger in the shadows, patient, still, observing. A faint breeze drifted through the tunnel. It carried the smell of iron and dust, pressing softly against my cheeks. The hum beneath the stone receded slightly, leaving only the weight of the unseen. I rose, careful, leaving the helmet behind. The alcove swallowed again, shadows pooling around its edges. The air felt heavy, pressing, patient, and I moved onward, the memory of its presence lingering against my skin. The tunnel sloped gently downward, damp and narrow. The air smelled of wet stone and iron, heavy and cold against my skin. My boots pressed into slick gravel, soft footsteps echoing faintly along the walls. Ahead, a faint glimmer caught the lantern's glow. Water ran silently along a shallow channel, smooth and dark, reflecting the flickering light. The air smelled fresher here, mingled with the damp, metallic tang of stone. I knelt beside the stream. The water was cold, moving slow and steady, carrying the scent of wet earth and mineral. Beneath the surface, shapes shifted, slight, deliberate, impossible to catch. I held the lantern closer. Ripples glinted in the faint light, twisting and curling as if something moved just beneath. The air pressed against my cheeks, damp and heavy, carrying a faint, bitter scent. A soft rustle drifted from deeper in the tunnel. The water shifted in response, subtle waves curling toward the edges, deliberate. Shadows stretched across the walls, pooling in the corners, flickering as I glanced at them. I leaned closer, careful not to disturb the stream. The rocks under my fingers were cold and rough, wet with condensation. The shapes beneath the water remained, elusive, patient, moving with silent, deliberate rhythm. The lantern flickered. The surface of the water trembled, reflecting pale light across the jagged walls. I could feel the air thicken, pressing gently against my chest, cold and insistent. A faint hum rose from the stone beneath my boots. It resonated through the tunnel, rhythmic, low, pressing through the soles of my feet. The water responded, rippling faintly as though aware of the vibration. I stepped forward slowly. The stream wound along jagged rocks, its surface dark and reflective, hiding shapes beneath. The air smelled of iron and damp stone, sharp and bitter, pressing around me. The shapes moved again. Subtle, deliberate, just beneath the surface. Impossible to see clearly. Shadows stretched along the tunnel walls, twisting with each flicker of the lantern. I crouched, leaning closer to the water. The surface was smooth, cold against my fingertips, moving slightly as though breathing. The hum beneath the stone persisted, rhythmic, insistent, filling the small space around me. The lantern trembled slightly in my hand. The water caught the pale light in uneven reflections, twisting across the jagged walls. The shapes beneath remained just out of reach, patient, deliberate, impossible to grasp. I pressed the lantern closer, watching the ripples and faint reflections. The air felt heavier, damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of iron and old stone. I could feel the presence of something beneath, patient, watching, moving slowly with the water. I rose slowly, careful not to disturb the stream. The shapes remained just beneath the surface, elusive, deliberate, hidden. The hum faded slightly, leaving only the sound of my soft footsteps and the gentle flow of water. I moved onward, careful, carrying the fragile lantern. The stream glimmered faintly in its narrow channel, patient, mysterious, almost alive. The air pressed gently against my skin as I left, the memory of movement lingering in the damp silence. The tunnel narrowed, damp air pressing against my skin. The lantern's pale light trembled in my hand, flickering over wet stone and jagged edges. The smell of iron and dust hung heavy, sharp in the cold. Still air. Then a metallic clang, sharp, sudden, echoing along the walls. No source. The sound bounced through the stone, reverberating deep, twisting around corners, brushing my ears and chest. My boots pressed harder against the gravel, soft crunching muffled by the echo. I froze. The lantern's glow wavered, casting trembling shadows that stretched and recoiled along the walls. The air felt heavier, pressing gently, carrying a bitter scent, faintly metallic. Another clang, smaller this time. It rolled to the tunnel like a stone skipping along unseen channels beneath the floor. Shadows pulled at the edges of the lantern, twitching subtly, curling with the vibration. I took a careful step forward. The gravel shifted under my boots, damp and uneven, sending tiny echoes through the cavern. The clanging returned, irregular now, unpredictable, brushing the walls and my chest alike. I leaned closer to the stone, fingertips brushing rough, cold surfaces. The vibration hummed faintly beneath my hand, rhythmic and insistent, carrying the metallic scent of old tools and damp rock. Shadows stretched, twitching in patterns I couldn't follow, deliberate, patient. A soft rustle came from the side tunnel. The clang responded, echoing off deeper stone, curling toward me, insistent and alive. The air pressed tighter, cold and still, carrying the scent of wet stone and iron heavy in my lungs. I stopped, holding the lantern high. Shadows recoiled slightly, then pulled, waiting, patient. The clang rolled again, deep and hollow, vibrating to the floor of the walls, my chest. I crouched careful, tracing the uneven stones beneath my boots. They were cold, wet, sharp at the edges, humming faintly with the echoes. The lantern trembled in my hand, light flickering across jagged stone and shifting shadows. Another clang, this one longer, deliberate, almost like something brushing along metal unseen. The air pressed in closer, cold and bitter, carrying a faint metallic tang. I moved forward slowly. Each step made the echoes swell, stretching to the tunnel, brushing against my ears and chest. The lantern's pale glow revealed jagged edges, wet patches, and shadows that twisted and pulled. I leaned closer, fingertips grazing the stone. The vibration hummed softly beneath my hand, echoing the clang, insistent, patient. The shadows pulled near the walls, curling, waiting, almost aware. I rose slowly, careful, carrying the fragile lantern. The clang faded, rolling into silence, leaving only the hum beneath the stone and the heavy, damp air. The tunnel pressed around me, patient, cold, and still. As I moved onward, the memory of echoes clinging to my chest. The tunnel narrowed, damp air pressing against my cheeks. The lantern trembled lightly in my hand, its pale glow stretching across jagged stone. The smell of wet earth and iron hung thick, cold against my skin. Then I saw them, small glimmers at the edges of the shadows. Pairs of glowing eyes, pale and steady, watching. I froze. The air seemed heavier here, pressing down, patient and silent. The eyes remained, blinking slowly, then vanishing the moment I looked directly. Shadows twisted along the walls, curling, retreating, and pooling again. The lantern flickered, casting trembling light over rough stones, wet with condensation. The faint scent of iron and damp stone intensified, bitter and sharp in my nose. I stepped forward cautiously. A soft rustle drifted from deeper in the tunnel. The eyes reappeared just at the edge of the light, patient, deliberate, observing. I held my breath. The air seemed alive, pressing against my neck and arms, cold and silent. The lantern's glow trembled in my hand, revealing shadows stretching toward corners I could barely see. The eyes vanished again, then returned, subtle, deliberate, just beyond the flickering light. They moved with the shadows, curling and twisting along jagged stones. I crouched slightly, fingertips brushing the wet floor. The stone was cold and rough beneath my gloves, damp and pitted with time. The air pressed heavier now, carrying the phantom of the tunnel and metallic scent, bitter and sharp. The eyes remained, unblinking in their darkness. Whenever I glanced directly, they faded, patient, deliberate, almost teasing. The shadows around them stretched, curling toward the corners, retreating, waiting. I leaned closer, careful, tracing a jagged edge of stone with my fingers. The air pressed against my chest, heavy, damp, carrying the faint smell of iron and dust. The lantern flickered, light trembling across walls and pooling shadows. Another rustle came from deeper in the tunnel. The eyes blinked into existence again, pale and deliberate, before disappearing as I looked. The sensation of being watched pressing on every side, patient, insistent. I rose slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness. The lantern cast trembling light across jagged walls and wet stone. The eyes lingered at the edges, unseen yet present, leaving a cold weight in the air. I moved onward, cautious, each step quiet on the damp gravel. The tunnel swallowed the eyes once more, but the memory of them pressed against my chest. The shadows pooled in the corners, patient, deliberate, watching silently as I carried the fragile lantern forward. The tunnel narrowed, cold stone pressing close. The lantern trembled in my hand, casting pale light across wet, jagged walls. The air smelled of damp earth and iron, heavy and still, pressing against my chest. Ahead, the passage split. 2 tunnels, dark and narrow, curling into shadows, each carrying a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. The sound was soft, curling around the stone, patient, deliberate, tugging at me from opposite directions. I paused. The gravel beneath my boots shifted softly, cold and damp, pressing against my soles. The whispers stretched and twisted, curling into the corners, impossible to locate, patient and insistent. I stepped forward slowly. One path smelled sharper, iron and wet stone, the other damp and earthy, carrying a faint metallic tang. The lantern's pale glow trembled across jagged walls, revealing shadows that stretched and recoiled in rhythm with the whispers. I leaned closer to the left path. The air pressed gently, cold and heavy, carrying faint murmurs, unintelligible but deliberate. Shadows pooled at the edges of the light, curling toward the tunnel's mouth and retreating when I glanced directly. A soft rustle came from the right passage. The whispers shifted, curling in both directions, tugging at my chest, insistent and patient. The floor beneath my boots hummed faintly, rough stone pressing cold against my fingertips as I balanced the lantern. I crouched slightly, listening. The left path breathed faintly, carrying the scent of iron and wet stone, rhythmic and slow. The right path hummed quietly, damp and bitter, pressing gently against my neck and arms. I stepped forward again, hesitant. The whispers tangled, pulling me toward both paths, curling along the walls, pooling in shadows. The lantern flickered, revealing wet stones, jagged edges, and shifting shapes that vanished when looked at directly. A sudden draft whispered through the tunnel. It carried the scent of iron, dust, and damp earth, pressing softly against my skin. The whispers intensified, subtle, patient, curling along both paths like living threads. I touched the stone wall beside me, rough and cold beneath my fingers. The air pressed heavier, almost alive, insistent, tugging at my chest from both directions. Shadows stretched across jagged surfaces, curling toward corners, receding when I looked directly. I stepped back, uncertain. The whispers twisted around me, soft, deliberate, pulling at my senses, impossible to ignore. The lantern's glow trembled, pale light pooling across wet stone and curling shadows. I took a breath, careful, slow. The left path sighed faintly, damp, metallic, curling toward me. The right path hummed, earthy and bitter, pulling gently in the opposite direction. I lingered, tore between both tunnels. The air pressed against my skin, cold and heavy, carrying the weight of unseen presence. The whispers remained patient, insistent, impossible to locate, curling along the stone in silent tension. I moved forward slowly, tentative, letting the faint glow guide me. The shadows pooled and twisted around jagged walls, curling and stretching with the whispers. The split tunnel waited, patient and silent, the air heavy with the scent of iron and damp earth, pulling softly, deliberately, in both directions. The tunnel narrowed, damp air pressing against my chest. Lantern light trembled in my hand, casting pale reflections over jagged stone and puddles of cold water. The smell of wet earth and rust clung to the air, sharp and bitter. Then I saw it, a mining cart, old and splintered, resting on worn tracks. At first, still, then it shifted, a subtle movement, like a breath through the cavern. The wood creaked softly, metal groaning faintly beneath the weight of nothing. The air pressed heavier, colder, carrying a metallic tang that stung the nose. I froze, heart humming quietly in my chest. The shadows around the cart pooled and stretched, curling along the walls. The floor beneath my boots was cold, damp, uneven, pressing faintly against my soles. It moved again, gently rocking, almost deliberate. The lantern light trembled in response, flickering across wet stone and jagged edges. A faint rustle echoed from deeper in the tunnel, soft, insistent, brushing my ears. I stepped closer, careful, fingertips grazing the rough stone wall. The air pressed against my neck, cold and still, carrying the smell of rust and damp wood. The cart shifted again, subtle, patient, as if testing the air, as if aware. I crouched slightly, leaning closer to the rails. The metal hummed faintly beneath my fingertips, cold and unyielding. The wooden wheels groaned softly, echoing in the narrow tunnel, vibrating to the floor beneath my boots. Another subtle shift. The lantern's glow trembled, casting long, flickering shadows that twisted toward corners. The air pressed heavier now, almost alive, wrapping around my chest and arms. I stepped back slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness. The cart creaked again, moving with impossible subtlety, as if guided by invisible hands. The floor hummed faintly beneath me, carrying the vibration through the stone, through the air, through my chest. A soft rustle came from deeper in the tunnel. The cart rocked once more, deliberate, patient, pressing against the silence that had grown thick around me. The lantern light revealed jagged walls, wet stone, and shadows that recoiled when I glanced directly. I leaned closer to the wall, fingertips tracing rough edges. The air pressed against my face, damp and cold, carrying the faint smell of iron and rot. The cart shifted again, the wheels whispering against the rails, soft, insistent, deliberate. I rose slowly, careful, hands steady on the lantern. The tunnel held its breath, patient, dark, alive in its silence. The cart waited, moving ever so slightly, leaving a weight in the air, a presence unseen but certain. I moved onward, each step careful, on the damp gravel. The shadows stretched and twisted along jagged stone, pooling in corners, patient, deliberate. The cart remained, shifting subtly, an invisible hand brushing against the silence, leaving me with the heavy, watchful air of the tunnel behind me. The tunnel narrowed again, walls slick with damp stone. Lantern light trembled, throwing pale reflections across jagged surfaces. The air smelled of wet earth, mineral and cold, pressing against my chest. I paused. The floor beneath my boots was still, rough and uneven, and yet small pebbles shifted, rolling quietly across the stone. No wind, no one above, just soft, deliberate movement. A shadow stretched along the wall, longer than it should have been. It twitched and recoiled, moving almost independently of my lantern. The air hummed faintly, pressing cold against my neck and arms. I stepped forward, cautious. The pebbles rolled again, brushing softly against each other, echoing faintly in the narrow space. The scent of damp stone sharpened, metallic, carrying a faint tang of rust. The shadows shifted again, curling in corners, pulling toward the tunnel's heart. I held the lantern higher, pale light trembling across wet surfaces. The floor hummed faintly beneath me, subtle vibrations through the gravel and stone. A soft rustling came from just beyond the lantern's glow. Pebbles shifted toward me, quietly, as if aware of my presence. The wall seemed to pulse with shadows, curling inward, retreating when I glanced directly. I crouched slightly, fingertips brushing the damp stone wall. The air pressed closer, heavier, cold and still, carrying the faint scent of iron and earth. The pebbles rolled once more, patient, deliberate, almost intentional. I rose slowly, careful, trying not to disturb the fragile quiet. The shadows stretched along jagged surfaces, twisting and pooling in corners. The floor beneath hummed faintly, vibrations carrying up through my boots, brushing against my spine. I stepped forward again. The rustling followed, subtle, impossible to pinpoint, curling along the edges of the tunnel. The lantern flickered, pale light trembling across wet stone and shifting shadows. The air pressed against my face, cold and damp, carrying the weight of unseen presence. Pebbles rolled slowly, curling toward shadows, away from me, silent witnesses to some invisible motion. The tunnel held its breath, patient, deliberate, alive in its stillness. I leaned closer to the wall, fingertips tracing rough, wet stone. The shadows pulsed in rhythm with the faint rustling beneath my boots. The air carried a metallic tang, damp and heavy, pressing softly against my chest. I moved forward, step by careful step. The pebbles rolled gently, echoing in the narrow corridor, small sounds that pressed against silence. Shadows twisted and recoiled, patient, deliberate, impossible to focus on directly. The lantern's glow wavered. The air pressed heavier now, almost alive, wrapping around my arms, my neck. The rustling of rocks and shifting shadows followed silently, patient, waiting, impossible to locate. I breathed slowly, careful, every step deliberate. The tunnel held its weight in shadow, cold stone, and subtle motion. The floor remained still beneath my boots, yet the pebbles rolled, whispering along jagged surfaces, carrying the heavy, watchful air of the mine around me. The tunnel seemed narrower tonight. Lantern light trembled across wet stone, painting long, shivering shadows. The air smelled faintly of damp iron and earth, heavy and still. I moved slowly, each step deliberate, careful. Soft gravel pressed beneath my boots, uneven and cold. And then I heard it, a faint echo, footsteps. Behind me. I stopped. The air seemed to thicken, cold and weighty, pressing against my chest. The echo shifted, soft, hesitant, and yet it followed the rhythm of my own steps. I stepped forward again. Another soft echo answered, almost perfectly in time. The walls seemed to lean in closer, wet stone slicked beneath my fingertips. A faint hum vibrated in the rock, subtle, almost imperceptible. I paused, breath shallow. The footsteps moved again, careful, deliberate, not random, but mimicking, each step matching mine, echoing mine, mocking mine. The lantern trembled in my hand, pale light flickering across jagged surfaces. Shadows pulsed along the walls, curling and receding in corners. The air carried the faint metallic tang of rust and stone. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, old with settling, loose stones rolling, but the echoes matched every step I took, and the silence between them hummed with intent. I shifted my weight, slow, careful. The echo did the same, perfectly mirrored. Cold pricked my neck, brushing across my skin, moving just behind me. I felt it unseen, patient, waiting. My boots crunched over loose gravel. Soft footsteps followed, not behind, not ahead, alongside me. The tunnel walls seemed to breathe in time with the rhythm. wet stone glistening. The smell of damp earth pressed into my nose, sharp and metallic. I whispered to myself, barely moving my lips. The echo paused, then resumed, in perfect harmony. I could feel it in my bones, this silent shadow of presence, soft, deliberate, inescapable. I took another step. The echo followed, matching mine exactly. I raised my lantern higher, light trembling across jagged stone and curling shadows. Nothing moved except the pebbles beneath our feet, rolling in time with the sound. I slowed, then stopped. The footsteps mirrored me immediately, careful, patient, watching. The air grew heavier, colder, pressing damp against my arms and face. A faint metallic scent lingered, sharp, almost like fear made tangible. I leaned against the wall, hand tracing wet stone. The echoes continued, rhythmical, tireless, haunting. Every corner held shadow, stretching, curling, impossible to focus on directly. The tunnel seemed alive, breathing, waiting, listening. I exhaled slowly, careful, deliberate. The footsteps echoed again, perfectly aligned with mine. I dare not turn my head fully. The weight of unseen eyes pressed in the darkness, patient, silent. I moved forward, step by step. The echoes followed, always one with me, a twin of sound and intent. The air pressed heavier now, thick with damp and iron, shadows twisting along jagged walls. And the tunnel held me, the footsteps and the silence together, unbroken, inescapable. The cavern yawned before me, wide and hollow. Air hung heavy, damp with the scent of stone, and something older, faint and metallic. Lantern light trembled against the walls, pale and fragile. I stepped forward, boots brushing loose gravel. Each crunch echoed sharply, swallowed quickly by the cavern's vast emptiness. Shadows stretched long, curling unnaturally along jagged rock. The ceiling soared overhead, impossible to measure, fading into darkness. A cold draft drifted down from above, brushing my neck, stirring the fine dust in the air. It carried whispers I couldn't catch, soft, indecipherable, patient. I moved slowly, lantern swinging, light trembling. Shadows shifted in corners, twisting in ways no shape should. One moment a jagged edge, the next a smooth curve, impossible and alive. The floor sloped slightly, slick with moisture. Water pooled in shallow hollows, reflecting the faint flicker of light like disturbed silver. I thought I saw something move beneath the surface, then nothing. Silence pressed heavily, deep and full. Even my own breath felt loud, sharp against the stillness. I imagined footsteps, or was it only the cavern responding to me? Lantern light caught on the walls again. Shadows seemed to ripple, stretching toward me, retreating, curling like smoke. The air smelled damp and mineral-rich, sharp, biting against my lungs. I reached out, fingertips brushing wet stone. It pulsed under my touch, cold and hard, almost throbbing beneath the lantern's glow. I pulled back, shiver tracing my spine. Every movement echoed, swallowed, then returned in fragments. The cavern breathed with a rhythm I couldn't place, slow and uneven. I could hear faint, distant drips, water striking stone, but somehow it was watching too. A rustling sound near my feet made me freeze. Pebbles shifted slightly, though the floor was still. A shadow twitched in the corner, vanishing when I dared to look. I stepped forward again, careful, deliberate. The vast emptiness pressed in from all sides, quiet, patient, expectant. My lantern trembled, casting light across walls that seemed to pulse, alive with hidden motion. The ceiling swallowed the light completely, shadows pooling like black water. I felt a presence above, or perhaps it was below, something unseen, waiting. The cold seeped deeper, biting through jacket and skin alike. Each step I took seemed to stretch time. The cavern seemed infinite, yet claustrophobic. Shadows danced at impossible angles, curling against themselves in ways that hurt the eyes. I leaned against a wall, hand brushing cold. Wet stone, lantern trembled, casting trembling light across the cavern floor. The air thrummed faintly, low, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I whispered to myself, barely audible. The echo carried far, bouncing against unseen walls. It returned slightly altered, heavier, slower, patient. I moved deeper, cautious, breath shallow. Shadows followed, stretching impossibly, curling at angles that made my stomach tighten. The air pressed down, damp and thick, scented of earth and rust, and something I couldn't name. I paused in the center, lantern light swaying. Shadows shifted, pulling together then scattering. I felt watched, entirely alone yet not. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm the shiver running along my spine. The cavern held me, silent, alive with impossible motion. Every shadow, every shift in darkness, suggested life where there should be none. I moved toward the faint outline of another passage, tentative, careful. Shadows bent toward me, then withdrew, a slow dance against the edges of my vision. The air hummed faintly, rhythmic, insistent. I whispered a name, no sound in the cavern but my own breath. The shadows trembled in response, curling and stretching in impossible ways. I felt the cavern watching, waiting, patient, eternal. The wind came first, a low whistle threading through the tunnel, thin and sharp. It carried a chill that slipped beneath my jacket, curling along my spine. Lantern light trembled against damp walls. Shadows stretched, trembling with the gusts, twisting across jagged stone. The air smelled faintly of rust and wet earth, heavy and sour. I stepped forward slowly, boots brushing loose gravel. Every echo felt wrong. Too many repetitions, too sharp, as if something else moved with me. A soft cry drifted on the wind, distant, mournful, almost human. I froze, listening. It faded into a sigh, then returned, closer this time. The tunnels curved, narrowing and dark. The whistle swirled through them, carrying fragments of voices. Names whispered, broken words, laughter and sobs from long ago. I reached for the wall, rough stone beneath my fingers, cold and wet. The wind caressed my neck, cold as a fingertip. It seemed to push me, insist I follow it deeper, further from the faint safety of the entrance. Lantern flickered. Shadows danced in impossible ways, twisting along cracks and jagged edges. I thought I saw a figure at the corner of my vision, gone when I turned. The wind shifted, stronger, a low whistle now carrying multiple tones. Crying, laughter, fragments of voices I could almost understand. It wound through the tunnels, circling, beckoning, and warning at once. My steps echoed too loudly, mingling with the wind. It seemed to mimic me. Soft footsteps behind me, offset, impossible to match. I stopped. Silence followed for a heartbeat. Then the whistling rose again, sharper, closer. I pressed my hand to the lantern, feeling the heat, the tremor of light. Shadows lengthened along the wet floor, curling toward me and away at once. The whispers mingled with the whistling wind, distant and intimate, like memories brushing against my mind. I breathed slowly, shallow, tasting damp stone and rust in my mouth. The tunnel narrowed again. The wind funneled through, carrying a sharp metallic tang. I imagined old tools, abandoned, clanging softly in rhythm with the wind. I moved carefully, lantern swaying, light trembling across walls streaked with moisture. The voices rose slightly, almost coherent, names of miners, fragment of laughter and crying. They came from all around, yet nowhere in particular. The wind pressed harder, cool fingers to my hair, biting at my neck and wrists. I felt the air vibrate with presence, something unseen moving alongside, beneath, beyond me. Lantern light flickered again, shadows quivering in impossible shapes. I whispered softly to myself, barely audible. The wind echoed it back, twisted, almost as if responding. Footsteps behind me quickened slightly, but vanished when I turned. I kept moving, careful, deliberate. The whistle circled, distant voices mingling with my own breath. Every corner I passed seemed darker, deeper, alive. I stopped at a small hollow in the tunnel. A breeze whistled through it, carrying a faint cry, almost a sigh. I let the lantern sway gently, shadows curling over wet stone. The wind softened, as if settling into the cavern itself. Voices lingered, faint, mournful, leaving impressions in the damp air. I stood alone, listening. The metallic tang of old tools and the faint whispers of miners long gone pressing against my skin. I moved on slowly, carrying the lantern, shadows stretching, whispers fading but never gone. The wind trailed behind me, patient, carrying voices that were almost memory, almost alive. I felt in my bones, cold, persistent, and I couldn't stop following it. The wall rose before me, rough stone slick with moisture. Lantern light trembled across it, casting shadows that danced and quivered. I felt the chill first, creeping along my neck and shoulders, soft and insistent. The markings caught my eye, thin lines etched deep, irregular, almost alive. They reminded me of eyes, of dozens of them, staring, cold and unblinking. I stepped closer, boots crunching softly over loose gravel. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rust and wet stone. Every inhale carried a whisper of damp decay, settling into my chest. The eyes, they shifted, just slightly at the edge of my vision. A blink here, a flicker there. I froze, feeling the stones themselves breathe beneath my fingertips. A faint hum lingered in the tunnel, low and rhythmic. It resonated through the walls, brushing against my bones. I imagined distant tools, long forgotten, vibrating softly in tune. The markings seemed to watch more closely as I lingered. A sense of weight pressed into my shoulders, patient, heavy. I could feel them through the lantern's pale light, tracing every movement, waiting. I moved my hand along the wall, fingertips grazing rough edges. Cold stone, moist, slick patches where water had pooled. The eyes seemed to follow, shifting imperceptibly, turning as I turned. My own breath sounded loud in the quiet tunnel, echoing against the stone. Soft footsteps behind me, mine mirrored impossible. I turned slowly, but the passage remained empty, shadows curling in corners. The markings were clearer now, carved with care, deliberate and strange. Lines that curved like eyelids, dots like irises, all shifting subtly when observed. I couldn't look away. The stone seemed to lean in, attentive, aware. I pressed the lantern closer, light trembling along the wall's surface. Every flicker of flame made the eyes shimmer, shifting slightly, rearranging. A shiver ran down my spine, leaving goose flesh in its wake. The air hummed, faintly metallic, carrying a smell of wet iron and dust. I breathed carefully, shallow, trying not to startle the silent watchers. But the deeper I looked, the more aware I became of the wall, of the tunnel, of myself. A soft rustle echoed from the floor, pebbles rolling without cause. Shadows lengthened unnaturally along the stone, stretching toward me, then receding. The eyes remained, unwavering, patient, alive in a way I couldn't place. I stepped back slowly, careful not to disturb the unseen gaze. The lantern swayed, casting light over the markings again. They flickered, shifted, watched. The tunnel seemed to breathe around me, the stone exhaling damp, cold air. I felt the weight of centuries in the walls, of miners long gone, and something else, something patient, lingering. I moved on quietly, leaving the staring wall behind, its eyes lingering in memory, tracing each step I took. The hum faded into the distance, the chill receding slightly, but the sense of being watched never truly left me. The ladder creaked before I even touched it, would worn thin, splintering at the edges. The air smelled damp, cold, like deep underground rain. I rested my fingers on the first rung. It shivered beneath my weight, loose, unsteady. Every breath echoed, long and hollow, bouncing off unseen stone walls. The darkness below was thick, a blackness that seemed to swallow the lantern's pale light, stretching into nothing. I felt it pull at the edges of my vision, tugging at the skin behind my eyes. A soft rustle came from below. Not wind, not water. Something alive, moving just out of reach, brushing against the darkness. I climbed slowly, each rung groaning beneath me. My hands were cold, slick with damp. I imagined something reaching for me from below, stretching upward through the void. The lantern swung slightly in my grip, casting wavering shadows along the ladder. Shadows that seemed too long, curling upward like fingers. Every step made the wood tremble, sending a shiver up my spine. The air grew colder as I descended. A faint hum resonated through the stone, low, insistent. It vibrated in my chest, mixing with the fear tightening my lungs. Something brushed my leg. Just barely, a whisper against my trousers. I froze, lantern light trembling on the walls. Trying to catch movement that wasn't there, I descended further. The ladder twisted and swayed as if alive. Every rung felt older, weaker, the wood moaning beneath invisible pressure. A presence lingered below, patient, waiting. I could feel it in the air, pressing from every side. Cold, silent, and hungry. The shadows clung to rungs, curling around my hands. They reached, stretching, brushing at my skin. I swallowed, tasting damp stone and dust, my breath shallow. I stopped halfway down, listening. The hum was louder now, almost rhythmic. Soft whispers floated in it. Names, murmurs, fragments of sentences I could not catch. My fingers gripped the ladder tighter. I felt the pull of something below, insistent, coaxing me downward. A subtle weight tug at my legs, urging me further into black. I swung the lantern lower. Light flickered across the rock walls. I saw nothing, and yet I felt everything watching, reaching. I descended the last few rungs slowly, each step heavier than the last, the ladder quivering beneath me. Something brushed my shoulder, soft, deliberate, unyielding. The darkness welcomed me, pressing closer. I could hear it breathing with me, or at me. I dared not look down, but I felt the ladder end somewhere unknown. I paused, heart hammering, ears straining. The hum faded slightly, replaced by silence so deep it pressed against my ears. The ladder creaked one final time, and I felt a hand, something unseen, reach for mine. I froze, lantern trembling, shadows dancing like flames on wet stone. I could only hang there, suspended, feeling the weight of the unseen, the last ladder leading me into nothing, into quiet dread that clung to my skin. The lantern flickered, soft light trembling against wet stone walls. The air was thick, cold, and heavy, pressing against my chest. I noticed first the shadows. They stretched long, quivering at the edges, then slowly merged, twisting together into shapes I could not name. The dim glow of the lantern struggled against the darkness. A faint hum seemed to rise from the stone itself. It vibrated through my fingers as I held the lantern higher, my palms damp. The smell of damp earth and rust filled my nose. I swallowed, tasting in my throat. Each breath felt drawn in by something deeper below. The walls seemed to move subtly. Not walls, something living beneath the stone. The shadows pulsed, curling toward me, wrapping, waiting. The lantern dimmed further, its light pooling into nothing, leaving the edges of the tunnel swallowed by black. I heard it then, soft, deliberate, a rustling that wasn't mine. Footsteps that weren't footsteps, brushing close, teasing at the silence. I took a step back. The lantern's flame fought against the darkness. Faint shapes flickered in the periphery, shifting when I tried to focus. The mind felt alive, cold, patient, aware. The air moved in whispers, flowing around me like water through unseen channels. A faint metallic scent, like old tools or decay, reached my nose. I realized the shadows were not just absence, they were presence, watching, waiting, shaping themselves around my fear. The floor beneath me trembled slightly. Nothing above, no one around. Just a mind, breathing, pulsing, alive in ways I could not understand. I moved the lantern lower. Light pooled around my feet, revealing walls slick with moisture. Yet the deeper shadows swallowed it, merging, stretching, reaching. I felt a brush along my arm. Cold, not wind, not stone. Something unseen moving through the black, brushing, testing, marking its base. I tried to step forward. The shadows rippled like water, folding, pressing, denying my path. Every step was heavier, the air thicker, as if the darkness itself resisted. The lantern sputtered, light flickering into a dim, uncertain glow. I could sense the mind's pulse more clearly, rhythmic, slow, deliberate. I held my breath. The shadows paused with me, folding, listening, waiting. The silence pressed against my ears, a soft, insistent pressure. The dim lantern revealed a wall ahead. The shadows pressed against it, merging, alive, unbroken. I could see nothing through the darkness, Yet I felt the mind watching, shaping, breathing. I took another step. The lantern dimmed further, almost extinguished. Shadows pooled together, a single mass, heavy and patient. The mind exhaled. A cold wave, damp and suffocating, brushing across my neck. I realized that I was not alone, though nothing moved. I stayed still, letting the lantern fight, letting the darkness around me. The shadows merged completely, folding into one, and the mind waited, alive, watching, and I was suspended in that quiet fear. The first light of morning seeped into the mind. Pale rays stretched across the damp walls, touching the stones with warmth I hadn't felt for hours. The air smelled faintly of wet earth, softened by the gentle glow. A stillness hung over the tunnels, thick and heavy, like the mind itself had paused. I stepped forward slowly. Footsteps echoed softly, returning only my own. The shadows that had followed, whispered, and pressed, were gone. The lantern lay dim and spent behind me, its faint glow replaced by the crisp, quiet light spilling from the entrance. I reached out, feeling the cold stone beneath my fingers, aware of every brush of dust and grit, every tremor that had moved through the walls. The tunnels looked different in the daylight, empty, silent, almost kind. Yet something remained, a memory, hovering at the edges of vision, watching eyes, never fully gone, flickering at the corner of my mind. I paused at a junction, where the paths had twisted, split, and pulled me into uncertainty. The air was warmer here, lighter, but the hum beneath the stone seemed quieter, patient, still aware. I breathed slowly. The damp smell of the mind softened with the sun. Shadows had receded, curling into corners, leaving the passageways pale and unbroken. A soft breeze slipped in from the entrance. It carried the scent of moss, distant soil, the quiet freshness of morning. It whispered through the tunnels like a sigh. I stepped toward the entrance. The stones beneath my feet were dry now, warmed by early light. Yet each step echoed faintly, a reminder of the mind's pulse, subtle and patient. The opening loomed above, brighter now, stretching into the sky. Colors washed the walls with warmth, gold, pale pink, soft orange. The shadows that had chased me melted into themselves, leaving only the memory of their movement. I stopped at the mouth of mine. Silence pressed against me, but not as before. It was gentle, accepting. I could feel the mind watching, still alive in some quiet way, but patient, letting me leave. The wind shifted softly, carried with it a faint, distant echo of voices, as if the miners long gone whispered a last farewell. It stirred the dust and carried it across the stones, touching my hands, my face, leaving a trace of all that had passed. I looked back once. The darkness of the tunnel seemed smaller now, contained beneath the pale, morning light. The markings, the eyes, the whispers, they lingered in memory only. The sun touched the entrance fully, casting shadows behind me that were no longer menacing, but quiet and still, stretched long across the rough stone. I stepped out. The air was warmer here, free, carrying the scent of earth and sky. My chest lifted with delight, yet the memory remained, a quiet hum, like the mind exhaling softly, letting me go. The shadows were gone. The eyes no longer watched, but a trace of everything I had seen lingered, folding into the memory of my own heartbeat. The sun rose higher. I felt the warmth on my face, the cool breeze at my back, and I realized the mind would wait, always patient, always aware, while I stepped into the light.